Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
I've been looking forward to this interview as well, because if you know me, you know that I am that worst sort of person. I am the armchair historian. Strategies of the Ukraine War is a political, military and social history of the East European subcontinent at constant war. We're talking imperial, national, civil, bands of roving brigands. I'm not even sure if we're going to go even further back into history, if we're going to have hordes of Mongols or Scythians or whoever else. But the man who has written this brilliant book is my next guest, who is Vladimir Shirogorov, and I'm delighted to say that he joins me live on the line now. Vladimir, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Whereabouts? Sorry, go on. Sorry.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet everybody.
The pleasure is all mine. Where do we find you this morning? Where are you this morning?
I'm in Italy, La Bella Italia.
There are worse places. Well, we talk about history and imperial wars and regional wars. Well, Italy is obviously a place that is full of conflicts. Ukraine, fascinating. Because, I mean, where do you start with this particular... What was the influence? What was the spark behind this particular book, Vladimir?
The spark of the period about which I am writing was dissolution of the Mongol Empire. And my personal spark to write this book and the books I wrote before was, of course, the situation that is currently war between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because we in Russia feel this war deep personally, because we are all from mixed families, and I have Ukrainians and Georgians and some other nationals of former Soviet Union between my close friends, between my relatives. So we feel this war as our deep personal situation. And I see in this situation it's obligation, a debt of historian, especially military historian, to sort out the things, to understand what is going on, to make the receipts for our, not only for politicians or military leaders, how to wage this war, but receipts for the public, receipts for the society, how to get through this war, remaining human beings. And only history could propose the right tools to do that. Only history, because besides history that embrace culture, human relations, including military actions and everything else, we don't have any other instruments to remain together, to remain human beings. It is the reason for me that I turned from my normal economic history, because I am economic historian by my education, to military history. And I am lucky that military history today, it's not only history of military activity, but more social, economic history. And it is the reason why I turned to Ukrainian war. And Ukrainian War is the title of my first book on military topics that was published in Russia in 2016. And it is a notion that I coined to understand what is going on in Eastern Europe, not only in Ukraine, that is currently one of the East European nations, but in Eastern Europe as a whole, because Eastern Europe as a whole is in turbulence, not only Ukrainian nation. And I coined this notion, Ukrainian war. What is Ukrainian war? Ukrainian war is historical clash over division and hegemony in the region that was former heartland of the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde is the western part of the Mongolian Empire. And destruction of Mongolian Empire imprinted on this clash some special features that are active since and that are active now.
Vladimir, Genius, brilliant. When people ask me why I study history, it is exactly the reasons you have given. And the fact that history is not a struggle between boring nations. It is a story of people who find themselves on different sides at different times. And when we look at the current history, we look black and white. We have to have heroes and villains. However, especially with Ukraine, it has been such a central part of the Golden Horn. It is the most important part. It is where East meets West. It has always been that gateway between Asia and Europe that has made it such an important strategic and tactical location from the Mongols. And in your book, 1500 to 1800, we've got the Ottomans. We've got the beginnings of the Muscovy Empire. We have the imperialist powers wanting to get involved. It is so rich in the same way that Egypt was vital to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the, because it had the resources. It was the breadbasket. So Ukraine is vitally important because not only where it is, but also the riches that it has.
You know that, first of all, it is very important to understand what is Ukraine. I see that now a lot of people, they know that translation of the notion Ukraine from Slavic languages, because it is the same notion in Russian, Ukrainian, Belarus, Polish, and so on. Ukraine is a borderland, a frontier. And why this frontier emerged? When the Mongolian Empire, Golden Horde, fragmented at the beginning of the 15th century, some large political vacuum engulfed southern part of Eastern Europe. What is southern part of Eastern Europe? It is very important to have this geopolitical view because northern part of Eastern Europe was a region of old, well-established political centers. The East European nations, Muscovy, that turned out Russia later, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that gave birth to Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus and other countries, they are located in the northern part of Eastern Europe. And in the southern part of Eastern Europe, there was a vacuum of nations. The first proper nation of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, emerged as an independent state only at the end of the 20th century. Before, all the territory of the south of Eastern Europe was the territory, area of clash of outside powers over its resources, clash over the territory, the people that inhabited this territory, and clash over hegemony on this territory. And hegemony on this territory brings hegemony over all Eastern Europe because it's the territory of great resources, agricultural, natural resources, demographic, economic, and other resources, and due to its strategic location. It was the reason why, at the end of 15th century, the emerging great powers of Eastern Europe, such as the Ottoman Empire, Muscovy, Poland, they rushed into this territory that was vacated after collapse of the Golden Horde, when Golden Horde's nomadic population migrated to the Central Asia. It was a desert named the Wild Field. And the powers that were located neighboring it, the Ottomans, Poland, Muscovy, colonized this territory, looking for resources for their imperial development. But Eastern Europe was suitable for imperial domination because its geopolitical core, which is the East European geopolitical Ukraine, is not similar to territory of Western Europe, divided by mountain ridges, rivers, by languages of different peoples that inhabited it. But it is well-consolidated territory. It is steppe. from the mouth of the Danube in the western Black Sea to the mouth of River Volga in the North Caspian Sea. All these 3,000-4,000 kilometers stretched from nowadays Hungary to nowadays Kazakhstan is plain steppe in which it is simple to move armies, colonists, population, resources to take control over it and then project the imperial power from this territory to outside territories. It was the situation why Russia, after it take over domination over this geopolitical Ukraine from the Danube to the Volga, in the late 17th, early 18th century, was able to project its imperial power over Eastern Europe, over Europe, and then became the global power. So, geopolitical Ukraine is a kind of a miracle instrument to gain the hegemonic domination. It is the reason why the clashes over this territory, including the current clash, are so fierce.
But if you look at some of you talk about steppe, and it is a land of maybe Cossacks. People can say, oh, it's the Cossacks in the area. If you look, for example, you mentioned Lithuania, Swedish Poland, Lithuania. Many of our listeners may not know about, Charles V of Sweden when he goes down taking on Peter the Great, and they have this huge clash, and it is the end game, which completely marks the end of Sweden as an imperial power, is Ukraine. And it also marks the domination, or that step, of Peter the Great to found what will become Imperial Russia. And that all takes place in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian leaders, or the warlords, have a huge impact on basically geopolitical European, sets the scene basically up until the 21st century of what happens, with Charles V, his Swedish army, his allied army, and that all takes place in Ukraine.
The story of Charles XII, the Swedish king.
Sorry.
It is very instructive when we talk about the East European geopolitical Ukraine and today's Ukrainian nation, because he had an option to march directly on Moscow. And really he had open gates to Moscow before him to march via Smolensk and Vyazma directly, the same way as Napoleon marched a little bit more than a century later. But he preferred to turn to Ukraine and confront Peter the Great in Ukraine. Why he did that? Because besides being a great tactician, Charles XII was a great strategist as well. And he understood the specific of East European warfare, of strategies of East European warfare. And one of its features was that during the main military campaigns, the East European military and political leaders, they worked not only to destroy the army of the enemy or to occupy the enemy's territory, but first of all, they worked to impose on the enemy the political regime that weakened it permanently. It was the reason of Charles XII's march to Ukraine, because he planned first to establish the independent Ukrainian state, because Ukraine was never independent until the end of 20th century. And he was the first grand politician who understands that it is possible to form, to shape Ukraine with its specific features of its population, specific language, specific culture, specific worldview as an independent nation. And it is not in vain that today's Ukraine has as its state banner the Swedish colors. Blue and yellow are Swedish colors. So it is a kind of strategic heritage of Charles XII. So he marched to Ukraine to establish Ukraine as an independent state, then establish another Ukraine, because southern part of Muscovy was different from its central part, from its heartland. So it was a chance at the beginning of the 18th century to establish southern part of Muscovy with such towns that is well known today during the current conflict, like Kursk, Belgorod, Voronezh, to establish this territory as an independent state as well, to create a belt of states around the central Muscovy, around the Muscovite heartland, to prevent Muscovy from being the European hegemon. It was his strategic plan. And really he achieved great results executing this plan. And his main misfortune was the Battle of Poltava. And it was really interesting fact that before Karl XII marched to Ukraine to fulfill his strategic design, Peter the Great evaded to go to direct clash with him. But as soon as Karl XII entered Ukraine, Peter the Great turned hungry for the battle, because he understood that the strategy of Charles XII had a chance for success, and he needed to prevent it from being implemented. It was his stake in the Battle of Poltava. And many people, when they are described the Great Northern War, an episode of which the Battle of Poltava is, they do not understand this great strategic game. But it is the same great strategic game that dragged Napoleon. You know that Napoleon, after he occupied Muscovy, he turned again, not back to Germany by a direct road, but he turned to Ukraine. It was one of the best feats of the Russian army during this war, that it blocked march of Napoleon to Ukraine, because he had the same idea to establish Ukraine as an independent state and create as a southern belly of Russia the chain of independent state to balance the growing Russian power, the growing power of the Russian heartland. The same strategic idea ruled over Hitler when he turned from direct march to Moscow again to Ukraine, to establish Ukraine as an independent state, as an ally of Nazi Germany, and relying on it in its war against the Soviet Union. So it is the dominating strategy of Eastern Europe. And it is Ukrainian destiny, goodwill, to be as a crossroad of this grand strategic design. It is the reason why the current war over Ukraine is not a kind of frontier operation, not small war, but it is war behind this grand strategic design, which has to determine the true position of Russia in Europe and globally.
Here is the thing, Vladimir. If Peter the Great is defeated in Ukraine, okay, that means, because you know how violent Peter the Great, when he comes to power, you know, he's looking to the West. He's not interested in the Eastern Muscovy Empire. He wants to be a European power. That is why he builds St. Petersburg. He has studied Amsterdam. The Russian flag is the same colors as the Dutch flag, because he's in Amsterdam. But if he loses to Charles in the Great Northern War, Peter the Great might have imploded. He might have been removed, because people were getting executed in Moscow all the time. We might have no Russian empire. So therefore, to somebody like Vladimir Putin, who has made his adoration of Peter the Great as the great Russian hero, of course he's going to have a personal interest in suppressing anything that happens in Ukraine, because that is, if you like, it's in his brain, it's hot-wired into his DNA, Vladimir.
You know that a really situation, if Peter the Great would be defeated in Ukraine, is not situation if, because he prevailed in the battle at Poltava in 1709, but he was defeated in the battle at Prut by the Ottomans together with emigrate Swedish troops led by Charles XII in 1711 in the battle at Prut in nowadays Romania. So the situation that Peter the Great was defeated in Ukraine, it really happened. What were the consequences? The consequences were decline of the Russian imperial power over southern part of Eastern Europe, Balkans and Southeastern Europe for nearly 6 decades, until Catherine the Great returned to Peter the Great's design, conquered Moldavia. Moldavia is eastern part of nowadays Romania. Today's Moldova has nothing common with Moldavia of the early modern period. So Catherine the Great turned to Peter the Great's design, conquered southern part of Eastern Europe, the belt of territories along the Black Sea northern coast, established the province of New Russia, conquered the Crimea, conquered the North Caucasia, and on this base, the global imperial greatness of Russia was established. So Peter's defeat at Prut in 1711 was the reason that this design was implemented only 7 decades later. So Peter's defeat in Ukraine is not if situation, it is a situation that happened. But Russia found resources to return to this strategy because it was the only possible imperial strategy to Russia. It is true, the proverb, you know, that Brzezinski, political advisor to American presidents, he coined the proverb that without Ukraine, Russia is not empire. So Ukraine, not the Baltic provinces for which Peter the Great fought with Charles XII. Nowadays, Estonia, Latvia, not eastern part of Poland, but Ukraine was the base of Russian imperial power from economic resource point of view and so on. And if you have a look at an economic development of Russia after the Industrial Revolution, nowadays Ukraine, eastern part of nowadays Ukraine, was its core. So it is the core of the Russian imperial power. And it is the only one, the sole existing imperial window for Russian development. So the current conflict is not only for a few regions of nowadays Ukrainian nations, but it is a conflict over geopolitical position of Russia in the global context. And it is very important to understand that when we are talking about the current decision-making by Vladimir Putin or by other politicians involved in this conflict.
When it comes to the Ottomans, and we've hardly talked about the Ottomans, one of their characteristics of their empire was they kind of let the people they had invaded or were in their empire almost act independently. Is that an okay comment to make? And so could we learn from maybe the Ottomans? Because the Ottomans perhaps had a better idea, rather than imposing themselves imperially, you know, with one system. The Ottomans tended to let various groups, various nations still keep their traditions as long as they paid tribute, they paid taxes, they sent military forces when needed.
first of all, it is very important to understand now that the Ottoman history from the 16th century onward, maybe to 19th century, is distorted.
Right.
Distorted by influence, first of all, of Hungarian-based historians who dragged the focus of the Ottoman history to Hungary and Balkans. But if you really look where the Ottoman Empire collapsed, where its future was decided in the 17th and 18th century, the territory on which the Ottoman Empire became a sick man of Europe. You know this proverb about the Ottoman Empire.
Yep.
It is not Hungary, it is not Balkans, it is southern part of nowadays Ukraine. The large Ottoman colony which Ottomans shared with their vassal Crimean Khanate existed from nowadays Azov. Azov, it is northeastern angle of the Black Sea on the Azov Sea to the Danube. All this territory was the Ottoman colony, and it was a prosperous colony with great slave latifundia, where the most of agricultural products for Istanbul, and Istanbul was biggest megapolis in Europe in that time, was produced. So Ottomans fought over this colony, first with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the second third of the 17th century. And really they conquered the Ukrainian part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But then Imperial Russia, that strengthened after eastern Ukraine on the eastern bank of the river Dnieper was merged to Russia. Russia strengthened. Muscovy turned Russia. And this Imperial Russia came to duel with the Ottoman Empire over domination in Ukraine. And during the last third of the 17th century and during the 18th century, Russia fought against the Ottoman Empire over dominance in the southern part of Eastern Europe. And it was the chain of wars in which the Ottoman frame was broken. And Ottoman Empire became not the mighty power of Europe, but a sick man of Europe. And if we have this look, if we see the Ottoman Empire from this special perspective, the Ottoman regime in the Balkans, on which the idea the Ottomans were a kind of loose empire that afforded to different religious and national communities to have their own life while they're paying taxes, it looks wrong, because the Ottoman Empire was the Ottoman Empire of iron fist mobilization of the military resources, first of all for war. And it was not important for the people who paid taxes, not only taxes in money, but taxes in blood as well, because they were mobilized to the Ottoman wars, under which organization they were suppressed to pay these taxes for the Ottoman might. And really, suppression of the Ottoman Empire really was very high to extract the resources for war.
We're going to run out of time, Vladimir. I've only got about 50 seconds before the news comes in. The book, listeners, you can order the book via our virtual bookstore. The book is called Strategies of Ukrainian War, Russia, Poland and the Ottoman Conflict. It is by Vladimir Shirogorov, who is speaking to today. Vladimir, it's been brilliant to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time today and for joining us here on Talk Radio Europe.
And thank you very much for your high qualified questions, because you direct the discussion in the right direction. Thank you.
The pleasure has been all mine. Vladimir Shirogorov, thank you so much for your time today.
Have a nice day. Bye.